Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Could it be a more beautiful October day? No, I don't think so. I learned a long time ago you should never ask more than two people a question like that, but I went out on a limb, so I don't think it could be a more beautiful fall day. Thank you all for joining us on this first public day of the exhibition Alphonse Mucha, Master of Art Nouveau, which opened last night to our members and opens to the general public this afternoon. We opened our doors at 11 o'clock this morning. Alphonse Mucha's amazingly beautiful work has had a very long-lasting impact on so many artists and art historians. He had a long and wonderful life. He did not have that long and wonderful a life, so I apologize. We think the birth date was 1860. We've made a mistake, I apologize, but I'm not sure it's 1860, but it definitely was not 1830. So sometimes we mess up, so my apologies. But more to the point, his expressive and beautifully seductive work was characterized by his portrayals of elegant women and elaborate use of color and ornament. And he played an incredibly prominent role in shaping the aesthetics of the direct decorative style known as the French Art Nouveau. And on behalf of my colleagues, I'm glad to welcome you all here for this show. My name is Marlene Hammond Whitmore, and I am the McPherson Director of Academic Programs here at the MAG. This new exhibition showcases over 70 works, including lithographs, drawings, books, portfolios, and ephemera, and due in very large part to the advanced reproductive techniques of the late 19th, early 20th century, Mucha's work attained celebrity that was almost unknown to his predecessors just a few decades earlier. His compositions were so alluring that they became known as the style Mucha, and embodied much of the artistic decorative endeavors around the turn of the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. His work was literally everywhere. Think Norman Rockwell meets Andy Warhol, meets Keith Haring, meets Banksy. It was everywhere. How many of you have been into the show? So you'll see that there was work that was done for commercial purposes primarily, to advertise cookies, to advertise perfume, to advertise theater productions, which is really how he got his start. And then an incredibly, towards the end of his life, a beautiful series of paintings known as the Slav epic, which are not at all well enough known. They're absolutely stunning and gorgeous, and live in the city of Prague, and unfortunately are not up for the public at this moment, but his foundation is working on that. Like all the 20th and 21st century artists, artists are always the best art historians. Mucha's work had a very large impact on his contemporaries, as well as artists that came after him. And in that vein, this afternoon we are joined by two artists, R.Roger Remington and Albert Paley. Both understand the tremendous visual and art historical impact of Mucha's work, and they'll discuss the impact that it has had on their work and other art movements. R.Roger Remington is the Vignelli Distinguished Professor of Design and Director of the Vignelli Center for Design Studies, at Rochester Institute of Technology in Rochester, New York. He graduated from RIT in graphic design and received his master's at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Roger is an experienced educator, scholar, and author with critical interests in graphic design history, research, and writing. His teaching was recognized in 1978 with the Eisenhart Annual Award for Outstanding Teaching, RIT's highest recognition of teaching excellence, and again in 2014 with the Trustees Lifetime Achievement Award for Scholarship in Graphic Design. Since 1982, Roger has been seriously engaged in the research, interpretation, and preservation of the history of graphic design. He's also written many books on graphic design and currently has a book in process on designer Will Burton with RIT Press. His deep commitment to design history and preservation has led him to bring the archives of designers of the American modernist generation to RIT. The Cary Graphic Design Archive contains more than 45 collections, and in 2010 he was instrumental in the establishment of the Vignelli Center for Design Studies, which houses the career archive of designers Massimo and Lella Vignelli, along with 15 additional contemporary designers. It is an architectural and an archive wonder. It's fantastic. Albert Paley is an active artist and has been for over 40 years, and his studio has been here in Rochester. He's the first metal sculptor to receive the coveted Institute Honors awarded by the American Institute of Architects, the AIA's highest award to a non-architect. Albert Paley is a distinguished professor and holds an endowed chair at the College of Imaging Arts and Sciences here at RIT. Commissioned by both public institutions and private corporations, Paley has completed more than 50 site-specific works. Just a few notable examples are the portal gates for the Renwick Gallery of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., Synergy, a ceremonial archway in Philadelphia, the portal gates for the New York State Senate chambers in Albany, Sentinel, a monumental plaza sculpture for Rochester Institute of Technology, as well as a 65-foot sculpture for the entry court of Bausch & Lomb's headquarters in Rochester, New York. Pieces by Albert Paley can be found in the permanent collections of many major museums, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and of course, right here at MAG, both inside and outside. Albert is a broadly published and international lecturer, and he received both his BFA and MFA from the Tyler School of Art in Philadelphia. He received honorary doctorates from the U of R in 1989, the State University of New York at Brockport in 1996, St. Lawrence University in 1997, and the University of Gothenburg in Sweden in 2012. The exhibition, which just opened yesterday, runs through January 19th of 2020. We can't bring these exhibitions to you without the generosity of our funders. So this exhibition was presented by Dawn Lipson with additional support from Alan C. and Joyce Boucher, the Elaine P. and Richard U. Wilson Foundation, and Janet S. Reed. Funding is also provided by Walter B.D. Hickey Jr., the Gallery Council of the Memorial Art Gallery, the Gouvernet Arts Fund at the Rochester Area Community Foundation, the Robert L. and Mary L. Sproul Fund, Marcia Lowry, Gary and Karen Neems, and Joanne Hume Negro and Ron Negro. Please join me in welcoming R.Roger Remington and Albert Paley.
Well, here we are again, Albert. 2 weeks ago, we were fortunate enough to come to the gallery and meet with some of the staff here in terms of planning this event. And we were lucky at that point in terms of having kind of a preview opportunity to see the exhibit as it was going up. And so I guess my first question to you, Albert, is what was your reaction and your feelings in terms of starting to see the exhibit go up and all of its magnificence?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I've known of Mucha's work since I was a student, and I was always compelled by his design sensibilities and sensitivity. He's actually quite a complex artist, and for us now to view his work at this period of time is kind of difficult because of everything that has happened over the time. But hopefully we can, unwind some of that. It's deceptive in many ways because in one way he was a commercial artist. He did advertisements for, wine and beer and bicycles and Whitman chocolates and all kinds of things. And we see him as kind of a commercial artist. But nevertheless, it was his main drive was very, very profound about his history with the Slav heritage. And well, anyhow, we can get into all of that. So it was good to see his work. But I think with all the work in the exhibition, you can see that there's a sense of unity to it. The quality of line and draftsmanship, the organic nature of it, the complexity, the symbolism. There's many layers that this can be read at and experienced.
I understand you have some Mucha work in your own personal collection. You want to tell us about that?
Well, as an artist, I never saw myself as a collector as such, but when I would see an object that I had a certain feeling towards, I would acquire it, mainly as kind of as a study collection to to become engaged with certain things and experience those realities. And so over the years, I've collected quite a few, not just Mucha, but various other artists of that period.
I was interested to read that Mucha early on was designing jewelry, and that you also followed that same path from jewelry into other things. You want to speak about that for a bit?
Well, actually, Mucha's involvement was quite complex. He left home when he was 17, and his first job was in Vienna doing stage set designs and murals. And he became involved with the whole theatric environment. He created, he would design costumes and murals and jewelry, and then he continued further into his art training. Mucha's influence, a lot of it was socially based, and the influences of Ruskin and William Morris at the time of bringing art to the public was very much a part of it. And so to create objects that people could use that had, to him, symbolic meaning was incredibly important. And that's one of the reasons that he gravitated towards the poster, because the poster was all over and it can affect the whole level of society and not just an elite fashion group. So there's a social consciousness behind most of his work.
It's always been interesting for me to, as a graphic designer, to reflect on the functionality and the presence of the poster between Europe and the United States. Now, here it seems to be now more of a collector's item kind of a thing, and in Europe it still functions as a communication vehicle. And I think that that tradition is very important as we look back to the period of Mucha's work.
It was before the internet, yeah. Now, as you know, back then, you had newspapers, but there's also kiosks in public squares where information would be put up, and that was a means of communication. And also, besides the communication aspect, there was a way to bring art to the public. And it was the high age of poster work. Lautrec, for instance, was well known.
That's
and
right.
When Mucha came in, his work was a lot more detailed and more subtle than Lautrec's, and that's when he got his main recognition.
So that brings us to Paris, and that kind of suggests to me the importance of Mucha in terms of, and his work as an Art Nouveau figure in terms of the importance of Art Nouveau as a period which tried to unify fine and applied art and bring the two areas together. And so that's why I think we see in Mucha's work so much interesting kind of poster work, and there's packaging, and there's commercial work, as well as these wonderful examples of his fine art, his painting, and particularly his huge posters. And so I think he was, I like to think of him as an important figure in this. I think it was I like to think of it as the period before the emergence of the European avant-garde. We're just seeing the beginnings of the breakaway from the Victorian decorative period and starting to move toward what eventually will become Bauhaus and then modernism.
Yeah, Mucha's always been associated with Art Nouveau, and basically Art Nouveau is the new art. And one of the main drives was to reject historicism. And in addition to that, there was a whole drive for the unification of the arts. So the fine arts were not separated from architecture, they weren't separated from decorative objects, and the artists could basically aesthetically deal with all of these aspects, and that was what the unification. And as you know, that's the basis of the Bauhaus philosophy and design theory, of that kind of unification and sensibility.
Right, and that there shouldn't be a separation between the different art forms, but that a given artist should be able to move seamlessly between architecture and graphic design and functional objects and weaving, and there shouldn't be this kind of arbitrary separations.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think that's important. Speaking of the poster, of course, as a graphic design historian, the poster is a very important medium. And I've collected over the years some kind of quotes of different designers and artists that speaking about their picturing of the poster as a vehicle for art and for communication. And I thought somebody might be interested with a few of these observations and maybe you could react to a few of these, Albert. The great Polish poster artist Tomaszewski, he said that a poster is a painting that moved out onto the street. And Cassandra, the great French poster designer, artist, said, "Poster is a machine for advertising, no less than a work of art, a machine for emotion." And I think my favorite all-time definition that I love to use with my students to the point where they start to roll their eyes is the definition of an effective poster. In a definition of an effective poster, this is according to the Russian constructivist designer and artist, Elizitsky. He said the poster must first address the intelligence, first must seduce the eye and then address the intelligence. So it's got to grab your eye and it's got to give you a message. And I think that that's not a bad definition of effective graphic design for that matter, or even poster art as we see it here. So that's a little spiel from my point of view, Albert, in terms of the importance of the poster and seeing Mucha's great posters. I'm impressed too as I look at the exhibit in these huge, wonderful vertical posters, and thinking a little bit about the technology that was used in producing these posters. I know some of you are aware of the fact that that in the time when Mucha was making these posters, they were made by a printing process which is called lithography, and these were large pieces of limestone that were ground, and the surface was prepared. And then the artist had to actually work on the stone, usually by hand, and usually backwards in a reverse manner, so that the thing would print right reading. And you'll notice as you go through the gallery and you see some of these beautiful big lithographic prints, posters, if you look really closely, you'll see on the edges of the lines, on the edges of the forms, a kind of a granular tone, kind of a little texture, and that's the grain of the stone showing through. So anyway, that's always impressive to me to think that Mucha had to paint backwards on these large, huge stones, which were larger than the actual poster, and he had to also pre-separate it in terms of many of these are multiple colors, so they have to make sure that the work is, the colors will actually become in register or aligned, as we say. So I think that there is a mastery of the technology that we see here also in the exhibit.
Yeah, one of the main turning points for Mucha, which is the main poster when you enter the exhibition, Grismonda, and that was for Sarah Bernhardt. It was interesting that Mucha was in Paris at that time, and he was working, doing the various ads for various things, and it was around Christmas time, and Bernhardt was displeased with the artist that was doing the poster for her, and they called this company, and there was nobody else in the office but Mucha. And so he decided to take on the project. It had to be completed by New Year's, which is next to impossible. So he stayed up night and day, and as I said, that stone was about 7 foot long, and did the drawing. But he was an incredible draftsman, And that is what projected him into international exposure, and that became the beginning of his career. And he did that throughout his life, pretty much.
I think this technology involved, for instance, in doing these posters, really attests to his being a master of not only the technology and the printing, but also of the artistic form that's coming through with that.
No, he was an incredible draftsman. Actually, when he was in Paris, he used to teach with James Whistler, and in Whistler's studio, he had all of Mucha's prints up, and somebody asked Whistler why would he have Mucha's prints up there, and he said, well, it's to teach the students how to draw. It's kind of interesting.
Could you speak a little bit more about your understanding of kind of the context in terms of which Mucha worked? We know he was Czech. We know he was from Czechoslovakia, and I've been fortunate myself in terms of having been in Czechoslovakia, Prague, and Pilsen, and having taught there and had a sense of the tremendously powerful creative art that exists in Central Europe. And for me, it's been a huge awakening compared to much of the German and Swiss and work that I've studied before. But you want to speak about?
It was a very complex time. This is his formative years were, prior to the First World War. And as you know, at that point in time, nationalism was kind of a main concern, and every country was trying to define its own character, and eventually that led to the First World War. And so, for instance, the Italians kind of drew on their classical tradition. The Germans and the Viennese went more towards the rational and geometric construct. The English were still within kind of the arts and crafts tradition. And Mucha, being Czech, was very concerned about his identity, because at that time the Austro-Hungarian Empire had basically outlawed the Czech language and also the Czech culture to be taught in schools. So he was he saw himself as a subjugated people. And his whole life, he tried to bring the Czech culture and Czech identity into the fore. And so much of that was dealing with, and that also was a time of symbolism. He was drawing on the symbolist tradition, and he was very involved with the occult and mysticism. So it was totally opposed to kind of the rational construct. Many times Art Nouveau is put in terms of anti-rationalism as compared to a rational construct. And as Roger had mentioned, that drawing on the reservoir of emotion and identity was very much a part of what he was about. At the end of his life, he produced a series of paintings, 20 paintings that were 20 foot by 30 foot, called the Slav Epic, and he dedicated his whole life to that. And he was very, he felt compromised in many ways with the kind of the decorative or the commercial art that he did, because his main thing was to basically vindicate his people.
Well, it's been interesting to me to looking at Mucha history to also connect this up with graphic designers that were part of this kind of Czech progressiveness after Mucha. These would be his descendants, and particularly two that I've done research on. One is Ladislav Sutnar, and the other one is Rossmann, his name is. And these two gentlemen were actually working probably in the next generation to Mucha, but I think they did represent in their own way a strong sense of Czech progressiveness, and I think that's very important as we think of what was happening in that period in terms of the European avant-garde, Cubism in Paris and Futurism in Italy, into style in Holland, constructivism in Russia and Germany. This was all following the kind of the pioneering breakdown of barriers that Mucha was beginning. So in a way, it was he was kind of a prologue to much of this.
Well, kind of. He saw it a little bit differently. He saw those movements as kind of fashion. And he always felt that art was eternal, that you were part of a process, you know, from going back into the present to the future. And he disregarded, you know, a lot of that. And he, you know, he heavily relied, again, you know, on the folk tradition. And, you know, at that time, you know, Dvorak and Smetana, a lot of the people, the musicians, were drawing on that really, you know, the gypsy culture and various things that was very much a part.
Mahler also.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think that's very important to see that crossing from one creative art form to another in the same period. So let's talk a little bit about more about kind of zeroing in on Mucha's form, okay? Because we see, I think, a very special form language happening in his work, and maybe you'd like to maybe kind of generalize and deconstruct some of this form for us.
Oh, it's, well, first of all, the one sculpture that's in the exhibition, it's called Nature. It's the bust of a woman. And he saw incredible symbolism in nature. And the posters that you see, there's a lot of natural forms. There's tree branches and flowers, and you know, the flowers dealing with the ephemeral nature of the human condition, and also the sensuality of the you know, the female form. And he felt physiologically that our eye muscles are determined to follow a curved line rather than a straight line. And so the harmony of the line, and as the harmony of the lines converge, that creates that kind of humanistic dimension. And as you can see, within the posters, you might have you have various forms and various elements, but the one thing that all the posters have is an incredible unity because of the quality of the line and the interlacing of that line. And the colors too, I mean, they're bright and vivid, but they're not, they're harmonious. They do not, you know, clash with one another. And so trying to create that aspect of harmony and balance, the emotional impact of that, it's something like music. When you have music that's very harmonious, it's very soothing, it creates this ambiance.
It's unified.
And then you engage with that.
Right.
And with the quality of line, that quality of line accentuated the human figure in very fanciful ways, the way the hair was drawn with, you know, incredible facility.
As we look at the overall format of his work, particularly his posters, I'm intrigued by the way in which he is in a very subtle way, moving away from a pure kind of symmetry. There's the beginnings of an asymmetric sense.
Well, his whole composition was based on the golden mean, and at the intersection of the golden mean, and all of them were balanced that way. Yeah.
Which is very interesting, because that suggests a more mechanical way of organizing space versus all the curves.
Well, not necessarily mechanical. I mean, Hogarth had the line of beauty that he developed, and there's that sensibility of a line of, you know, when does a line get too sharp or too bent, you know? Mm-hmm. So it's that whole interplay. Yeah.
Well, and what about the color? What about his color, use of color?
Well, most of the colors, as I said, they're not jarring. They're very subdued one to the other. But again, it has to do with the richness of that. Because what he wanted to do was, by using the figures, by using the imagery, by using the color, is to draw you more and more into the reference. He felt that there should be meaning in his work, and that the meaning had this symbolist tradition about it. And because a lot of the figures are very kind of very elusive, and just to draw you into that sensibility.
Well, so I guess my, coming from Mucha to Paley, how do you process your interest in Mucha and his work in terms of your own internal processes of...
This is a psychological study,
that's right,
Roger?
That's right.
Yeah, that's an interesting question.
See, the one thing I try to do whenever I have a chance to interview Albert, I always try to come up with some questions that really make him squirm.
No, as a teacher, he's a good provocateur, you know. So, you know, it's interesting. I mean, anybody can become skilled in whatever profession that they do. You know, you kind of learn the technique, you kind of learn to do it. But I think ultimately what happens is that, you know, why do you do what you do, and why is it kind of important to you? And for me, you know, growing up, when I did, you know, the 50s were incredibly a conservative time. You know, it was the man in the gray flannel suit. It was, you know, so unreal, you know, the Ozzie and Harriet TV programs. And then there's also, after the Second World War, there's the drive for commercialism and, you know, and the development of suburbia and Levittown. So you had all of this, for me at the time, in retrospect, it seemed all very, very superficial. And when I first started seeing work from the Art Nouveau period, it was a totally different sensibility. And it was very intriguing. I think that everybody has their own kind of, you know, personality or emotional balance or whatever that might be. And I think through the process of living that you gravitate towards things that you're sensitive to. I remember the first piece that I saw, I must have been 15 or 16 years old. My family was, we didn't have much money at all, so I always would buy things at the before they called them antique shops, they called them junk shops. And I would go to a junk shop, and everything was like burnt umber. Everything was dark and brown. And back on the shelf, I saw this iridescent, glowing thing, and it actually was a Frederick Carter piece from Steuben. And so that was the first piece that I acquired, that there seemed to be some kind of sensibility that was unknown.
It was speaking to you.
Yeah, it wasn't pop art, you know, it wasn't that kind of thing. It was deals with sensibility and this kind of a sensual response. And also too, you know, everybody responds to your own, you know, the zeitgeist of that period. And in the 60s, for instance, you know, one of the other terms for Art Nouveau was Jugendstil. It was a youth movement, youth style. And everything that was happening in the 60s, a lot of the rock groups were using Art Nouveau calligraphy for the, you know, for the posters and the things. And yeah, so that was kind of what was happening, and I seemed to gravitate more and more towards that, rather than adhering to a philosophy. Oh, okay. Many times what will happen is with the arts or with everything, it's hard to generalize because you have a huge spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, you have a philosophy that you believe in this, and out of that belief system, you develop a design theory, and then that design theory is manifested in the work you do, and that work then reflects the philosophy. The other end of the spectrum is one that's more kind of, instead of rational based, is more emotional based. And emotions by their nature are, you know, invisible and non-literal. Music comes from that. It articulates the emotion, it articulates certain sensibilities that other things do not. And for me, the fundamental, you know, drive of the symbolism and the organic nature and everything of Art Nouveau is based more in that emotional kind of context. And I just felt more gravitated towards, towards that. Even now, if you go to, discotheques or you go, or whatever, you see Art Nouveau posters all over, and it's there's kind of a
Environmental.
a sensibility, to that. And it was also kind of a, also too, at that time, it was during the Vietnam War, and there was all of the clash of the establishment and the youth culture and all that. It was all part of that
Sex,
dynamism.
drugs, and rock and roll.
Yeah. It's interesting with Muqam, talking about sex, drugs, and rock and roll, that
Now we're getting down to the good stuff.
he was very good friends with Lautrec and also Gauguin, and he was very good friends. But he said that they were just violent animals, the way he put it, because Mucha he was so he produced so much. His work ethic. He worked 16 to 18 hours a day. And he just felt that the drinking and the womanizing that Lautrec and Gauguin were involved in would totally dissipate his creative abilities. So he was very shy of that. So there's kind of a deviation from the sex, drugs, rock and roll. Yeah.
Well, that's great. One thing as a graphic designer I've been interested in, and I'd be interested in your comments on this, and that is the in much of Mucha's work, particularly the posters, we see a very fascinating use of letter form and lettering as it integrates with the pictorial form of the figure and so forth. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, I mean, it was part of that kind of commercial, venue that he would take anything and put it within an aesthetic context. I mean, he took hatchets and spears and all kinds of things, or leaf shapes, or whatever that might be, as far as that unity. In a lot of ways, when you think about the 50s and the conservative nature of the 50s, the polarization of that was abstract expressionism. And in many ways, everything that was driving abstract expressionism, non-literal form, the emotional context, the immediacy, or whatever, was very much part of the kind of the Art Nouveau thing. A total break with the past, a total new vocabulary. Right. So,
yeah, no, that's very useful to see it that way. I think I like to think that the element of letter form within Mucha's work is very customized to unify with the rest of the language, and I think that's a very important aspect. And it goes along with what you mentioned before about having a sense of Mucha's form as being really unified.
Well, the unification has to do with line and gesture. It isn't a stagnant. It's yeah. No, there's a real paradox with that, because what happens is when the artist is drawing a line, you're experiencing from this point to that point, and the line has a momentum, and the line starts and the line stops, and the artist is experiencing motion. And I think as the viewer, when you see those lines or you see those curves, the arabesque, you're experiencing all that. And the strange thing is that it's not moving. So intellectually, that it's a stagnant image, but emotionally, you're experiencing motion. And so that's one of the intriguing factors that is purely part of the human condition, is how we bring paradox together. The two things can diametrically oppose one another, but come together with our human sensibilities. And that's very much some of the things that happen, whether it's that quality of color, the quality of music, and the quality of line, is that frozen state that you enter into, that you create your own sense of rhythm and harmony and identity with.
So how do you see, let's back up a little bit, how do you see Mucha in relationship to the historical evolution toward modernism?
Well, actually, even though in Paris they called Art Nouveau in Paris the Mucha style, at the time he really didn't embrace that at all. He felt that he was not part of that. But I think it was, I guess, the main fundamental. Well, see, he's kind of a paradox. Because he has a lot of traditional background to him. But that quality of line and the organic nature, Horta and in Brussels, picked that up, and Van de Velde, and it's all much part of that. I guess it was kind of opposed to the organic as compared to the geometric. You got the geometric was more, more rational, more intellectual. And the other one drew on an emotional base, so you had that kind of polarization. And all through the history of art, you had the dialogue between line and color. There was always that polarization that happened, and I think probably that at that time everything was being looked at as new. Again, back to national identity. They're trying to define their own national identity, and then all of that collapsed, after the First World War, and then out of that was Reconstruction in the biggest terms, stylistically and
the avant-garde
and whatever, it just and it's interesting after the well, anyhow, but yeah.
So, kind of stepping back from all of this, trying to get a more global picture, historical picture of Mucha. What are your feelings?
Well, the one thing with Mucha and also Art Nouveau was the first international style. It was the first one that really went beyond the borders of the country, and I think that we talk now quite freely about globalization, but back then it was an incredibly new phenomena. You had the World's Fairs and the different expositions that came together that brought countries together, and that was usually in a localized place. But with the telegraph, with movies, with everything that was happening, all of a sudden things spread out globally, and he had an incredible impact. He, at the height of his fame in Paris, he came to the United States. Mainly, he was out of money. He didn't have any money, and he thought that all the wealthy patrons here would buy. He was doing portraiture at that time, and he did some projects here, but it never really panned out. But yeah.
How did you know anything about his relationship with his contemporaries, with other artists?
Well, he was. Well, first of all, his intimate circle. He stayed with the Slavic immigrants in Paris. He left when he was 16, and he was an expatriate for 30-some years because of what had happened. He was very good friends with Rodin. Actually, Rodin was part of that sculpture that was the impetus for that sculpture up there. He was very involved with the theatrical arena, with Sarah Bernhardt and all that. Gauguin, he was good friends with. He was very involved because of he was very involved very early on with camera work, not aesthetically, but he was using the camera, with his models to start developing the forms and all of that. So he knew Nader and several of the other people. Yeah, so he was quite.
How do you feel that some of his critics? How did they express themselves about his work?
Well, at the time, he was an incredible. After he got the Grismonda poster, he was very, very successful. Within 4 years, he was doing all of these. He did a couple of the exhibition pieces, the design decoratifs, for instance. He would design a whole array of things for, from cutlery to furniture to carpets, and that people would use, to produce. And but then after the First World War, he fell into, because it was seen as kind of high society was seen as frivolous, and the whole aristocracy was, the whole populist movement after the First World War. And then when he left the United States after a handful of years, he went back to the Czech Republic, committed his life to the Slav epic, and at that time he was considered a subversive, and Hitler kind of condemned him as being a nationalist and a subversive, and actually he was taken in by the Gestapo and interrogated pretty harshly, and he died, about a week later.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So and he was in total obscurity at that point, and it was only because of his son Jerry, who I met a couple of times. His son started doing writing and started bringing. And then when the '60s, came and they started to be, looking back past modernism to that precursor, started to bring Art Nouveau to the fore, and that's when the exhibitions started happening. And his son was very instrumental in bringing his work back and getting that kind of revival.
I wonder is he still alive, his son?
No, his son died.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, well, we've covered quite a bit of ground here. I'm wondering if we have some questions from the audience.
How did you get to meet your son?
She asked, how did I get to meet his son? Well, actually, besides, I work all the time. I'm totally boring. I just work all the time. And the only reading I do usually is art historical reading. And so I became very involved, aware of Mucha. And one of the first trips I took to Europe, I went to Prague specifically to see, Mucha's work, and also his home was open at that time. And so I met his son there then. This was in the early '90s. And then I met him in New York once when we were doing a book signing or whatever. But yes, there's quite an intersection at different periods of time. Yes?
Did Mucha influence your work?
Well, yeah, they said that Mucha influenced my work. Mucha was only one. That whole period, the whole symbolist period, and the Art Nouveau, and also the arts and crafts from from Europe with Ruskin and Morris and all that. It was all part of that. And I've gone to several other places to see other. Hector Guimard was was part of that whole thing with the Paris metros and all. It's all part of that. So, that kind of sensibility that deals with. I'm not a minimalist by any stretch of the imagination, and that sense of complexity and the sense of the organic line and organic form and space is very much a part of what my response has been. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Could you bring up an image on the screen there that you could talk about so that we get a better sense of what you mean by symbolism?
Oh, okay. For instance, I don't know. There's a couple of pieces in the exhibition that are from my collection that I loaned, and one of them is the Leslie Carter poster. It's the big poster in the middle of the exhibition, and so you look at that, and so you see this, it's called. Casa. It was Leslie Carter was an actress in the States, and when he was over here, he did the poster. And what the poster depicts was a woman, a young woman, who was about to go into a nunnery, and she was a virgin, and she was seduced by a prince, and she had a child. And after she had the child, she went insane. And she went into an institution, and her mental condition, she only thought she was there one day. So here you see this figure of this beautiful woman and the symbolism in the back. You have the lilies that go around that talk about the purity of that. There's two hearts up there that show the aspect of love. And then there's several crowns of thorns to do with the suffering. So there she is, kind of presenting herself to you. And if you look at the face is like blue, and there's this haunting character about it. And so some people come in, they just see it as a decorative poster, but that sense that goes through. Also, he was very involved, very, very involved with the occult and mysticism, and he tried to bring all of those sensibilities to the fore. And one thing was kind of, well, now it seems kind of strange, but he was very involved with automatic writing, that he would go into kind of quasi-trances, and he would write, and he would feel that he was getting references from other artists and other people or whatever. And those things, and there's symbolisms in there of the zodiac. He was a Mason, so there's a lot of the symbolic symbols from that. So there's that depth of iconography and imagery in there. So it appears very decorative and very superficial, but when you go into that, that is not seductive at all if you really look at that piece. So.
I know he did a couple of things in terms of architecture, like he did a jewelry shop, interior, and a perfume shop. He didn't do a lot. A lot of the other people that think about Marlene Nouveau did a lot of architecture type work. Do you know anything more about why that worked out?
Did you want to answer that?
Did people not care for the stuff that he did?
No, not at all. But yeah, exactly. Actually, the interior of that shop is in I can't pronounce the museum, Colette Museum or something like that, and yeah, in Paris. That's there. He did a lot of the design. Mainly, he was doing graphic, the graphic work, and and the paintings and the murals, and he. Most of the people were architects that did the furniture and the facades or whatever, but he never really. He designed a pavilion, I think, for the 1900 World's Fair for Bosnia, but other than that, no, not architectural work.
Why did he do more sculpture?
Well, when you look at his record, the amount of work he produced, it's just almost unbelievable. The Slav epics specifically, 20 by 30 foot, and he did 20 of them in 16 years, plus all the other stuff he was doing. I mean, it's unbelievable. And he only did like 2 or 3 pieces of sculpture. No.
How was his work perceived by the public, say in Paris or in?
Oh, it was very. I mean, he was incredibly popular. But it's interesting that talking about the poster I was just talking about Leslie Carter. So it was a big extravaganza at that time. It was open for one night. It was a total flop. And it went bankrupt. And he had done over 250 drawings in addition to the poster, and he never got paid 1 penny for it. And then also, just before he left the United States, he had developed 6 of the Slav epic that was presented at the Brooklyn Museum. And at that time, the Brooklyn Museum, there was over 1 million people that came to see it. And at that time, you paid to go into the exhibition. And he waived that. He just said that this should be open to the public. So he was very, art for the people and that type of thing. And he went back, not necessarily penniless, but he always struggled financially for that. And that's one of the reasons too that his things were not put into production as such. And the money that he got for the posters were very, very little. I mean, it was just basically a design fee, and they would execute it.
Do you know, in terms of the large-scale posters, how many of these were actually printed?
Well, there's a record on that. Sometimes,
Would have been. I know that the printing process itself would be laborious. And so I doubt if they were, say, more than hundreds or something like that.
That was pretty high volume, whatever. I don't know if some of you know Bob Marks, the artist in town. He was there after the Second World War in Prague, and it was a pretty destitute situation. And he went to a fish market, and they were wrapping the fish in Mucha posters.
Paper shortage.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's see, there's a question way in the back. Could you speak up?
I had an unusual question, I suppose. The artists and, I guess, sources of inspiration for Mucha. What were your thoughts on, I guess, Mucha's predecessors? And do you gain any inspiration from them as well?
Well, basically with Mucha, he started his father wanted him to be a bureaucrat. His father was in kind of a government position, and at 17 he left home and he went to Vienna to work for a theatrical company. So at 17 years old, he started his involvement with the theater, and then he went to an art school in Vienna, and also went to an art school in Munich, and then finally went to Paris. But that whole thing based on his sense of identity and his sense that his subjugated nation, basically under the German aspect of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, that he all of these inspiration and all the imagery came from the folk traditions and the Slav epic, and plus all of the technical, the draftsmanship and all that stuff that he learned. But that was the symbolism. Plus, he was extremely. He was a choir boy for many years, and he sung. Music was very much a part of his life, and that whole emotional aspect of music and complexity is very much a part of his sensibility. And so and at that time, the Slav culture, around the 8th and the 9th century, that was the epitome of what they were involved in, and that whole Byzantine sensibility. You see the mosaics and the jewelry and all the richness in the posters, kind of bringing back the ambience of that aura. Yes, sir.
Could you tell us something about his family life?
Do you want to?
No, go ahead.
Let's see. I think this is right. His father had been married before, had a couple of children. His new wife, Mucha, was the only son. And his father worked in a kind of a bureaucratic capacity as a clerk or something like that. And so he left home at 17, and he didn't go back until he was gone 30-some years. So he had very little. He had no contact with his family at all. Around 1903, I believe it was, he married, and his son, his only son, Jerry, was born, and for him, I mean, it's very. Freud would probably do a great analysis of him, because at the time he was doing, in the United States, the Gibson girl was the icon of female sensuality, and the Mucha woman in Europe was that, and because of that, and him being in high society, I mean, he always found that it was a problem, all of the demands on him. So he basically was an incredible workaholic. I mean, when you read his journals, I mean, the amount that he produced was just inconceivable. I mean, just inconceivable. And he literally worked all the time. He he was raised Catholic, but the spirituality was deeper because it went into mysticism, and it went into the occult and all of that. And he just felt that that artists should bring that inner self out, and it was very much based in humanism. I mean, fundamentally based in humanism. So.
This is a random question. A few years ago, there was an architectural forum in Buffalo, which, of course, has great architecture from the 1880s through the 1930s period. I happened to be driving while an art historian for the tour was on the radio, and he said, one of the problems with modern architecture is that it looks like the box that the historic architecture came in. Isn't Mucha in some way more relevant than ever at this point with the shape of the world that we live in and work in? I missed the Hilma Clint show at the Muqam a little while ago, which was curated by Richard Armstrong. I would love to have seen that. But it just seems to me that there's something coming from this that we need to look at.
You know, it's interesting with anything, with any period of time, things will go to one extreme and then it swings back to the other extreme. It's kind of the pendulum theory, that it goes back and forth from, you know, rational to irrational, from emotional to intellectual, but the pendulum never goes the same place. It zigzags, you know. So, and in many ways, with economy of means, with philosophy of modernism and all of that, you had the international style that developed in that grid-like such sensibility, and went on, you know, for decades and decades. And then with a new technology that was developed with the computer and so on and so forth, with Frank Gehry and whatever, that again you get back to the sense of organic architecture, which is, you know, is a lot different. When you go into an Art Nouveau building, it's like if you walk through the woods, you get this very serpentine kind of sensibility, and when you walk, you don't usually walk in a straight line. I mean, you go around things, you do this and that, so it aligns more to, yeah. I mean, the same thing in the in the early with Corot and all of that. You had the identity of the individual with landscape and the subtlety of landscape and the color and the ephemeral nature of clouds and all that. That your human condition kind of unified with that. And in many ways, the organic architecture kind of does that type of thing. And that's why landscaping is so important with architecture. It helps soften that interface.
That seems like a beautiful place to end, but I would like to give Roger and Albert a chance to bring us to a close in another way if you would choose.
Final words about Mucha.
I would say that the only thing is when you go there, it seems very, very decorative, and that has a negative connotation these days. But and a lot of it is for commercial advertising. But the depth of him with an artist was far greater, and he dedicated his life to the sense of meaning and kind of artistic salvation through that. And if you look deeper in that and try to understand what you're seeing and what you're feeling, it'll give you a greater understanding of what is being presented.
I just would say finally that Oliver Wendell Holmes, the great American jurist, once said that a mind that is stretched never returns to its original shape. And I would say thank you, Albert, for stretching us all Mucha.
Okay, Roger.